It's always so cool to see different people going and serving in different ways and doing different things because, like we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks, how we've been called to something. We've been invited by Jesus to different things. And last week we took time and we talked about how we've been invited to purpose. We've been invited to a life of purpose. And we just have to be willing to step out into that purpose to then really discover what Jesus has for us. And so today we're gonna continue our series, Invited. Today we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 6, starting at verse 30. We're going to be looking at being invited to significance. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I had big dreams for my life. Do you know what I mean? Anyone else have just big, crazy dreams, what you wanted to do? I wanted to be an astronaut. That was my big. I specifically remember being, I think it was because my parents let me watch Apollo 13 way too early in life, and I was like, this is going to be great. I'll go up there and get trapped in a spaceship too. That'll be fun. And then I was like, no, I wanted to take it even farther. I wanted to be the first man to land on Mars. I'm now thankful that God called me to something else because I hear that first trip's going to be a one-way trip. Nobody's coming back. I'm good with staying here, you know what I mean? But if you talk to kids, you'll find out that they've always got big plans. Now, those plans change and different things like that, but when we're young, we all have these grand, big, exciting plans for our life. And then sometimes what ends up happening is we kind of get beat down by life. Do you know what I mean? Maybe you experience something that happens to you that eliminates that possibility for you. Maybe you end up, telling someone your dream and they tell you it's impossible. They tell you there's no way. Maybe you just get into the rut of life. And as you get into the rut of life, you forget the desires you had to make an impact. And today, as we take time and look at Mark chapter 6, starting at verse 30, we're going to look at an invitation that Jesus gives to his disciples. The strange thing about this invitation is it doesn't look like an invitation. It looks like a problem. Most of the times, the invitations that we have in life are disguised as problems. And Jesus gives an invitation to his disciples. And so instead of reading the entire passage, we're going to take time and we're going to walk through the whole story. And we're going to look and see what happened. So we're going to start at Mark chapter 6, starting at verse 30. It says this, it says, the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. See, the disciples had just been taken out. They had just been taken out had just been commissioned to go. And so they went out and they began to spread the gospel. They were given authority over demons and sickness. And they were all of these things. They got to go do what Jesus had been doing. And all of a sudden they find themselves ministering to people. They had been just sitting on the sideline. They had been just sitting off to the side watching Jesus do everything, but now all of a sudden they've had the opportunity to go and to do what Jesus did. And they come back from this experience excited. They're sharing stories. They're talking about, the people that they saw, the people they met, the lives that were touched, all of these different things. They're excited because now they have a purpose. They have found a purpose. And all of a sudden they come back to Jesus. And we're going to move on to verse 31 here in a moment because I love how Jesus prepares them for significance. Okay, they had found a purpose, and that purpose was going and helping people. But how many of you know that you can find a purpose, but it doesn't make a significant difference? You can find a purpose, but unless you're all in and you're going and God is beginning to bless what you're doing, it'll be limited. We'll be stuck doing what we're able to do, not what God wants to do through us, because there's a difference. So we're going to continue to look at this, verse 31. And he, being Jesus, said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away to the boat, in the boat, to a desolate place by themselves. I love this passage. Okay, they come back, they're excited. Jesus, we've done all these things. Like Jesus, the plan worked. You sent us out. All these things have happened. And Jesus tells them, great, let's go relax. It's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect, right? Like it almost would make more sense to be like, great, now go out again and go even farther and stay out longer. Now that I know that it worked, now that I know that you guys didn't completely mess this up, let's branch out. Why don't you guys go out and we're going to spread this thing? That's not what Jesus did. Jesus instead says, all right, let's go away. Let's go to a secluded place. We need to go rest. We're not good at this. Here's what we've got to understand. In order for the disciples to be able to be significant and to make a significant difference, they had to take time and rest. Before they could ever go and make an impact like they would, they first had to learn to rest. This is something that Jesus would do. That Jesus would just disappear into the desert at times. When big things were going on, all of a sudden Jesus would disappear. And one of the craziest things about this is it describes what's going on. It says, many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. In other words, they were so busy. This was a bad time to take a break, right? There's too much to do. But Jesus tells them, no, let's go. Let's get in the boat. Let's go somewhere else. This has been a really hard lesson for me to learn personally. Okay? I may or may not be a little bit of a control freak. Not with everything. There's some things I just legitimately don't care about. But with some things, I'm a control freak. If you don't believe me, ask my wife. Ask her if we're both going to the same place, how often I let her drive. Not very often. It's not because she's a bad driver. She's a great driver. In fact, she keeps me out of accidents more often than not because I'm looking at the scenery and she's going, brakes, brakes, brake lights, slow down. She still does not know how I don't die whenever she's not with me. But I like having the steering wheel. I like being in control. I like having that. And one of the things I had to learn was I'm not that important. Like that's something that's kind of hard to learn, isn't it? Like in the grand scheme of things, I always have to remember that I'm not that big of a deal. I'll tell you exactly how I had to learn this, the hardest way, and it was when I got into ministry and, became a pastor and all of this, and, You know, when you're a pastor, you care about the church and you make sure everything is working out right, and you notice all the things that go wrong and all of this. And I mean, more than once, many times people come back and be like, that was a great service. And I'm like, that was awful. Everything went wrong, you know, but nobody else noticed, which is great. Thank God for that. Thank you, Jesus, you know. But I'm sitting there with this whole idea that I've got to make sure everything is perfect, everything works out, all of this. And what I began to do is that when we would take family vacations, I was smart enough to tell my board, hey, make me take a vacation this many times a year. Otherwise, I will run myself into the ground. And the first church that we were at, I would tell them this, but then I would always try to sneak back for Sunday. It's like, hey, I'll take a week off, but I'll make sure that I'm home for Sunday so that I can make sure everything goes okay. And then I started learning that doesn't work, because then you're preparing all week and it's not really a vacation, and it creates stress and tension and all of these things. And so then I learned that I had to actually remove myself. And I had to be gone for a Sunday. Now, I will confess, the first few times I ever did that, I was on the phone about 1 o'clock when I knew everyone had left the church, on the phone with a deacon saying, how did everything go? Was there any issues? Was there any problems? And then we started live streaming the services, and so then I was able to just spy on everybody, and that's exactly what I was doing, you know? And I would do this, and then all of a sudden I began to learn something. I would be gone, and sometimes I'm gone for a couple of weeks in a row just to recoup and recharge and all of these things. And then I started realizing that lives still got touched when I was gone. And lives would be changed while I was gone. People would grow spiritually when I was gone. People would get saved when I was gone. And I suddenly had to realize that in the grand scheme of things, I'm not that important. Because Jesus doesn't need me. God doesn't need me to accomplish what He wants. And sometimes what we end up doing is we refuse to take a break because there's too much work to do. We refuse to take a break because we sit there and go, well, there's all of these things. Someone has to do it, and if I don't do it, nobody will. You think too highly of yourself. Just really and truly. And I had to learn that. I've heard some people say this, especially if you find yourself getting really involved into ministry, and ministry does not just include, being on staff at a church or something. If you are leading a Sunday school class, you're in ministry. If you are teaching kids, you're in ministry. If you're leading a small group, you're in ministry. If you're on the worship team, you're in ministry. All of these things. And what you'll hear people say when they really start getting into it is they'll say things like, well, the devil never takes a break, so I can't either. Best response I've ever heard to that is you need a better role model. Right? Plain and simple. It's the whole idea, if you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of anybody else. Another great way to look at this is when you get on an airplane, and if you have children and you're flying, one, you're already nervous because is my kid going to scream the whole time or not, And you get in the airplane, and then they tell you that, hey, if the oxygen mask falls down, don't put it on your child first. Put it on you first. And that always sounded like an awful and selfish idea until they explained that, no, if you're so busy trying to get your oxygen mask onto your child that you pass out, then you can't help your child either. So you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself so that you can care for others. This is a principle that Jesus applied. He rested. And before we can understand and before we can have a life of significance, you have to learn to rest. And that's what Jesus is teaching them. There's so much to do. There's all these things going on. And he says, let's get in the boat and let's go to a desolate place where we can rest. But how many of you know things don't always go as planned? And that's what we experience here. So they began to go to another place. And then verse 33, it says, and now many saw them going and recognized them and ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. I love that. They got there ahead of them. And then verse 34, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. A couple things I just want to point out before we move on. This would have been a great opportunity to be annoyed. Do you know what I mean? Would have like, hey, we're getting away, we need to go rest, we need to do this, and all of a sudden the crowd sees the boat. Like, you get in a boat, nobody can follow you in a boat. You get in a boat and you go to the other end, and you get there, and the people figured out where you were going. And so now you don't get a vacation. Now you don't get to rest. Now you have to do more. And what I love about this is that, yes, Jesus wanted his disciples to do all of that, but when he saw the crowd, he had compassion on them. Why? Because Jesus loves people. He loves people, and he loves people even when they're annoying. Do you know what I mean? He loved them even when they were annoying, even when they would follow him, even when he was trying to go and rest, but they just kept following. The one piece that you don't know, because we didn't read this, is just before this story, Jesus gets word that his cousin John the Baptist has been beheaded. And so there's a very good chance that not only is Jesus going away to rest, but he's also going through a season of grief. And sometimes when you're going through a season of grief, all you want is to be alone. He invites his disciples, let's go away, let's rest, let's recoup, let's take care of this. And the people follow him. It would have been a great opportunity for Jesus to be annoyed. But instead of being annoyed, Jesus had compassion on them. If you want to live a life of significance, if you want to make a difference in this world, you got to care about people like Jesus cared about people. It's really easy to get really pessimistic about people. It's really easy to look at society and be like, who needs it? It's really easy for us to get this whole mindset of, I just want to be by myself, leave me alone, I don't need people, none of that. But when you look at Jesus, what you begin to understand is that Jesus loved everybody. He cared about them and had compassion with them, and because he had compassion, he was able to put aside what he wanted and began to teach them. So not only do you have to learn to rest and recover and take care of yourself, you have to learn to love people even when people are annoying. But then something interesting happens. This is where it gets really interesting. Verse 35 says, and when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. So the disciples are faced with a problem. There's all these people out here, and there's no food. Like it was supposed to be a desolate place so that they could go away and hide, so they weren't planning on a large crowd. They didn't make sure it was near a village or somewhere that would have food where people could go buy it. No, they're away from all of that. And the disciples come to Jesus and they say, Jesus, you need to tell the people to go home. You need to tell them to leave because there's a lot of them and there's no food. Like, just imagine this, okay? We later find out at the end of this whole passage that there was 5,000 men who were there, which means that there very well could have been 10 to 15,000 people in total out there. You ever gotten hangry? That's where you're angry and hungry at the same time. Anybody? I get hangry, okay? Have you ever been around 10,000 people who are hangry all at once? It's a bad idea, right? This is why they put food trucks at big concerts and festivals. That way you can go get something to eat. The problem is that there's no food trucks where Jesus is. There's no food. There's nowhere to go. None of these things. And all of a sudden the disciples are going, this is not ideal. They're faced with a problem. Jesus, you need to send them home. You need to send them away so that they can go eat. And you got to understand, the disciples are not coming from a place of any sort of lack of faith. They're not coming from any sort of any of that. They care about the crowd. They are seeing a need, and the most logical answer to that need is to send them away so that they can go buy food. And this is where Jesus invites them into something else. In verse 37, it says this, it says, but he answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? I mean, this is great. Like, you're sitting there, you're looking at, 10,000 people or so who are hungry. You tell Jesus, this is a problem. We need to take care of these people. Go ahead, send them away. And Jesus says, well, feed them. Just imagine being one of the disciples with me. They're like, huh? How? Like, there's 10,000 people here. They even point out, they're like, it would cost 200 denarii of bread. A denarius was 1 day's wage for an unskilled laborer. I mean, 1 day's wage. So we're talking 200 days worth of pay for bread to feed the crowd. And they're like, what do you mean go feed them? How are we going to do that? I mean, and what Jesus is doing, he's inviting the disciples to meet a need that is bigger than themselves. It's beyond their ability. It's beyond their capacity. They have no way of accomplishing this. And Jesus is looking at them and saying, you feed them. You feed them. The problem is the disciples are blinded by their own sight. See, all they can see is the problem. 10,000 people are hungry. And now Jesus wants us to feed them. Can I just say, there had to have been more than once where the disciples looked at each other and said, why did we follow this guy? Like, he says weird things. 10,000 people, go feed them. Yeah, right. But then we can see what happens. They ask him, should we buy 200 denarii worth of bread to feed these people? And then it goes on. And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Now, this story is recorded in all 4 of the Gospels. It would have been a very memorable story to them. They all would have remembered what happened. they go out. Jesus says, go find out how much bread there is. Go tell me what you have. And so they go out, and the Gospel of John tells us that they found a boy with a sack lunch. And this boy had 5 loaves of bread and 2 pieces of fish. And they go and they get the boy and they bring him to Jesus and they say, this is what we have. Now just think about this for a little bit. It would have been really easy for the disciples to look at him and say, that's clearly not enough. Kid, keep your lunch. Put yourself in the situation. All of a sudden, you're one of the disciples. He says, well, go find out how much bread you have. Okay. So you begin walking out among the crowd. Anyone have any bread? Did anyone bring a lunch? Do you guys have bread? And they're like, no. And the disciples are probably out there talking to each other. Like, this man's crazy. Like, we are wasting our time. And then some kid all of a sudden comes running up and says, I have bread. It would have been really easy for a disciple to sit there and say, okay, just no. You're not going to, kid, you can't help us with our problem. But they look and he's got 5 loaves and 2 fish and they say, well, let's take it to Jesus, I guess. And they bring it to Jesus. You see, it would have been easy for the boy to just keep it for himself. It would have been easy for the disciples to say it's insignificant, not important, not enough. It would have been easy for anything else to happen, but instead, they bring the loaves and fish to Jesus. We pick up what happens in verse 39. It says, then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by 50s. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, said a blessing, and broke the loaves, and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of the fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. See, there's a lot of times where we're faced with a problem that feels impossible. In fact, if you're following Jesus, you will be faced with a problem that feels impossible. I mean, you think about the Great Commission, go into all the worlds. I mean, go into the entire world? Go tell everybody? That's too much. That's too big. See, the disciples were faced with a major problem, and likewise, there will be moments where you're faced with major problems. And you've got to come back and begin to realize something in all of this. I want us to look at, just real quick, we're going to look at the boy, and we're going to look at the disciples in this. Because there's something here that we need to grab a hold of, okay? The boy didn't have much. He didn't. He didn't have enough food to feed everybody. He didn't have enough food to take care of the need. He had no ability to change the situation. All he did was take what he had to Jesus. And that's all Jesus needed. Now, for me, in my mind, I like to question Jesus, why did you do things this way? Like we know from the book of Exodus that God in the past had manna fall from heaven that was like little pieces of bread for people, and people were able to pick it up every day, and it fed over 1 million people every day for 40 years. And when they complained and wanted meat, all of a sudden a big windstorm came in and flew in thousands upon thousands of quail to feed all of these people. And we know those stories. And so it's like, why did Jesus need the loaves and the fish? Right? Like, if really and truly, if Jesus wanted to, he could have sat there, had everybody sit down, said a prayer, and T-bones popped out for everybody. It could have happened. He's the Son of God. There's no reason it wouldn't. So why did he tell them, go find what bread you have? Why? Sometimes it doesn't make sense. Why did he tell the disciples, go find what we have? You see, Jesus didn't need the loaves and fish. He didn't. But I believe that Jesus wanted that boy to be a part of the story. Can you imagine being the boy? Like, think about it. Can you imagine going home the next day? Mom, you're never gonna guess what happened. Those nasty cakes that you made me, everybody ate them. You know? I mean, think about it. That's a story that kid would have told the rest of his life. Jesus took my sack lunch and turned it into enough food to feed 10,000 people. And there were 12 baskets left over. Why did Jesus have them look for the bread? Because he was inviting them to be a part of the story. See, Jesus didn't require the boy to have enough bread on his own. All he wanted was the boy to bring what he had. And it's the same way for you and I. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to have all the education. You don't have to have all the knowledge. You don't have to have the skill set. You don't have to have the family background. You don't have to have the history. You don't have to have the boldness. You don't have to have any of those things. The only thing you have to do is bring what you have. That's what the boy did. See, this is what happens. When somebody brings Jesus all that they have and they say, Jesus, this is for you to meet need. This is for you to do with what you can. Jesus blesses it and multiplies it. See, he wants to use you. It's not that he has to. He doesn't. He wants to. But you've got to be willing to bring all of you and all that you have and give it to him. And let Jesus bless what you have. And then watch and see what happens. But there's one other group I want to talk about real quick, and that's the disciples. The disciples probably felt like they were on a fool's errand. Go find how much bread you have. Go see what we have. Go find out what's out there. See, the role of the disciples this time wasn't to meet the need. It was to find someone else who could meet the need. And it would have been so easy for them to come along and to say, this kid can't help. This is too much for this. This kid can't do it. It's not going to make a difference. I'm not going to bring this one to Jesus because it doesn't make sense. It's not logical. But instead, they found anyone who was willing and brought them to Jesus. See, the disciples didn't actually solve the problem. The disciples found somebody that God would use to solve the problem. Sometimes we are too quick to judge somebody. Sometimes we're too quick to look at, a kid or a teenager or whatever it may be, and we're too quick to say, well, I don't know how God's going to use them. If they just stay out of jail their whole life, we'll be happy. Like, I don't know what's going to happen there, or they're too far gone, they've messed up too much, or they're too dumb, they can't understand all of this. How are they going to be used by God? Or they've got this, or they've got that, and we will disqualify people that Jesus never disqualified. Our job isn't to make that determination. Our job is just to go find what's out there and bring it to Jesus. See, it doesn't matter how much or how little you have or somebody around you has. When Jesus gets a hold of it, when He blesses it, it multiplies. See, we've been invited to a life of significance, a life that makes a difference, a life that can change the world, but it's not because of your abilities and it's not because of my abilities. It's because Jesus wants to take what we have and He wants to multiply it. The question isn't what do you have? The question is, are you willing to bring what you have to Jesus? I'm going to invite the worship team up. We're going to take time, we're going to worship, but we're also going to take communion today. We're going to remember the sacrifice that Jesus gave.